Hey Hope City, it's Phil here. Today we're going to continue with week 4 of our series, Knowing and Loving Ourselves. This year, as part of our exploration of all of life in God's presence, I want to explore our call to integrate our emotional lives with our growth and with our discipleship as followers of Jesus. Specifically, I want to talk about knowing our feelings today. I want to talk about how we deal with the feelings that we usually label as negative feelings. Feelings like sadness, feelings like anger or hate, or even jealousy. You see, as followers of Jesus, we don't have to hide our brokenness or fix it before we are loved. The cross of Jesus tells us that we are invited into God's presence just as we are. We are invited to know and love ourselves the way He knows and loves us. Not that He leaves us as we are, but I just want to make clear that it's within His acceptance and His love for us that there is space for God's Spirit to begin healing and transforming us. It is His acceptance and love that invites us to return to Him, that invites us to repent. I want to return to our theme scripture for this series just to set the tone. This is Psalm 139, verses 1 to 3, and this is how it reads. You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. And just like when we talked about this week 1, this very first prayer that emerges out of these verses is this: Lord, you know me and you love me. You see, God's love for us as He fully knows us is really the foundation and the guide for this journey as we begin looking within. And so we have begun talking about our family of origin. We started talking about our anxiety. And now today we're going to talk about our emotional life. You see, our emotional life is probably the most powerful and influential part of our lives. It affects our mood. It affects how we respond to people and different circumstances and situations. And yet our emotional life is often the most mysterious and most hidden part of who we are. It's the least understood part of who we are. But foundational to our journey is really God's complete love for us, His complete knowledge of us, that the things that are a mystery to us, the things that we don't understand about ourselves, He knows. He knows us fully. And when we ask Him to search us, we're really saying, we hope that not only do you know us, but we want to know ourselves the way you know us. The second part of this theme passage for us, again from Psalm 139, this is verses 23 to 24, the last 2 verses of this psalm. And it reads like this: Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. This second prayer that kind of arises from this psalm is this: Lord, I need your love to transform me. Lord, help me to know what's going on inside of me so that I may bring all of me to all of you. You see, the deepest cry, I think, of the human heart is not only to be loved superficially, but to be loved deeply. To be loved as we truly are. And to be loved deeply, it requires us to be known. It requires us to be known by God. It requires us to be known by ourselves. It requires us to be known by others. We're talking about being loved, and we're talking about being loved for who we are. And who we are is a mixed bag. I am a sinner and I am a saint. I want to be loved for my strengths and my weaknesses. And the amazing thing is that deep, lasting transformation happens when God's deep love takes a hold of us. The educator, activist, and the author, Parker Palmer, he says it like this in this commencement address to some graduates. He says, As you integrate ignorance and failure into your knowledge and success, do the same with all the alien parts of yourself. Take everything that is bright and beautiful in you and introduce it to the shadow side of yourself. Let your altruism meet your egotism. Let your generosity meet your greed. Let your joy meet your grief. Everyone has a shadow. But when you are able to say, I am all of the above, my shadow as well as my light, the shadow's power is put in service of the good. Wholeness is the goal. But wholeness does not mean perfection. It means embracing brokenness as an integral part of your life. You see, when I reflect on what he's saying here, I think what he's telling us is that God is inviting us to bring our whole selves before him, to be completely loved by him, both our shadow and our light. And God is inviting us into a deep awareness of what is going on inside us emotionally, that we may pour out our hearts to him. This is the second verse that I'd love for us to reflect on as we're thinking about and as we're considering journeying within. This is Psalm 62, verses 5 to 8. And it reads, Yes, my soul, find rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock and my refuge. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for he is our refuge. You know, I wonder if we can hear that call, that trusting God means that we can pour out our hearts to him, that we can reveal all that we are to him, all that we feel to him. So when it comes to talking about our emotional life and our feelings and diving into that, where do we start? How about we start by talking about perhaps the difference between emotions and feelings? Here's how the psychologist Alice Miller puts it. Emotion is more or less unconscious, but at the same time a vitally important physical response to internal or external events, such as fear of thunderstorms, rage at having been deceived, or the pleasure that results from a present that we really desire. By contrast, the word feeling designates a conscious perception of an emotion. All right, so just to pull back from that, just a summary, emotions, this is what the psychologist is saying, emotions are more or less unconscious. They are physical responses to things that happen within us or things that happen outside of us. In a sense, all of us are emotional beings. And in terms of our emotions, we can't help experiencing our emotions. They just happen to us as life happens to us. Feelings, however, are how we process our emotions. And so our feelings require awareness, it requires reflection, it requires understanding. So feelings are how we perceive and interact with our emotions. And I think here's the challenge. Many of us find processing our emotions incredibly difficult. Many of us have grown up with rules that affect how we deal with our feelings. For example, in some cultures, showing any sign of sadness is seen as weakness. Or in other cultures, expressing anger is seen as a sign of immaturity. Or perhaps in some churches, showing grief is actually seen as a sign that we lack faith. And I want to pause for a moment here. I don't intend to go on a huge tangent, but just allow me this. I believe that grief is not lack of faith. Grief is a profound expression of love and of hope combined. Grief is the painful celebration of the good and beautiful in God's creation and of God's presence in our lives when we experience loss. It's the painful celebration of what He's put in our lives, the goodness that He's put in our lives. And if we need any any encouragement that grief is okay, and as followers of Jesus, that it's not only acceptable, but it's encouraged. It's this: the shortest verse in all of Scripture is 2 words, and it's John 11:35, and it simply reads, Jesus wept. You see, Jesus grieved when his friend Lazarus died, and he grieved when he saw the pain that Mary and Martha experienced, even though he is the resurrection and the life. Even though he knew he would raise him from the dead, he still experienced being fully God and fully human. The fullness of personality, the fullness of emotion. He expressed his feelings as a human being, expressing grief. I don't know how many of you have actually watched WandaVision, but I'm not going to give anything away, but there's this one amazing line that Vision has that I think is pretty much the key to much of the show. And in it, he asks, what is grief if not love persevering? You see, grief is the profound expression of love. And when it comes to grief, the Bible is completely clear. We are called to mourn with those who mourn, rejoice with those who rejoice. And when we grieve those that we have lost, and we grieve not as those who do not have hope, but we grieve with the hope that Jesus gives us. Right? Okay, so end of rant. But in summary, perhaps our culture, perhaps our family of origin, and perhaps even our churches have contributed to our difficulty in processing our feelings. And I think as a result of this, many of us have learned to avoid or repress or to rationalize away, explain away the difficult feelings that we have, like sadness or anger or grief or even hatred. But many of our feelings are needed in order for us to be alive to ourselves, for us to be alive to our world, and for us to be alive to God. He is a God who made us like him, and he has emotions, not like us, but we reflect his emotional personality when we experience our emotions as well. We're made to be emotional beings. Personally, I wrestle with this. Because I know I definitely feel things. I have emotional responses to life, but I find that I often can't describe what I'm feeling or why I'm feeling these emotions. And for me, it can take days. And you can imagine, if Grace and I are having difficulty or conflict, sometimes she has to be incredibly patient with me before I can figure out what I'm feeling and to be able to engage in a discussion of what I'm experiencing. But often when I'm experiencing emotions, especially emotions like anger or disappointment, when I feel threatened, I find that my feelings will bypass sort of the processing part of my brain, right? When I experience anger, when I experience disappointment, I quickly go into fight or flight mode, and I find that I'm unable to process what I'm going through. And so for me, what I find helpful in terms of processing my emotions is going for a walk or going for a run. I find that it helps my heart and my mind slow down and kind of sync up. You see, when I'm bothered by something, I tend to leave the headphones at home. I'm not listening to music. I'm not listening to an audiobook. I'm actually trying to walk or run and just listen to what's going on inside of me. For me, the difficult feeling that I have, or the feeling I have difficulty processing is anger. I often don't know what to do with it in the moment. And so often I avoid dealing with it. I sweep it under the rug, and things always will come out, right? Like if you sweep enough stuff under a rug, all you create is something big in your living room for you to trip over. And often that's what happens, not literally, but just like figuratively in life for me. And so a question for you as we're talking about our emotions and our feelings: what feelings have you learned to either avoid or repress or explain away, rationalize away? I want to share with you one of the spiritual practices that I believe can help bring our emotional life into God's presence and can allow Him to help us unpack what's going on inside of us. This spiritual practice is called the practice of examination. And while I know to those of you who are students this sounds scary, in reality we're simply just pausing at the end of our day to pay attention to God's presence with us and within us. We are examining our lives and we're just simply reflecting on our day. And we're just trying to notice the times where we are aware of His presence and times where we are unaware of His presence. And one of the core elements of this type of reflection involves exploring the emotional landscape of our day. And so if you can imagine a landscape, right? You've done a little bit of hiking and you're at the top of a mountain and you can kind of look out and look at this beautiful landscape before you. And this landscape has its share of mountains, right? These peaks. And it also has its fair share of valleys, these lows, right? And so the mountain peaks emotionally can be described as feelings of peace, feelings of joy, feelings of excitement, feelings of contentment. And these are commonly known, according to this spiritual practice, as feelings of consolation. And then we go from the mountains, right, mountain peaks, and we experience the valleys, the emotional valleys, feelings of angst or feelings of anger or feelings of discontentment or disappointment. And these are known as the desolations. At Hope City, we've taken this practice, and we haven't called it that, but we've embedded it into our microchurches. We begin our time together by sharing our highs and sharing our lows. You see, as a community, we believe it's a way of paying attention to God, both in the emotional highs and in the lows of life, that all of our lives are lived in His presence. But in terms of a more personal application, I believe it's important that we sift through our feelings and that we process them with God, because our emotions don't simply pop up. They don't simply show up when we experience them and then they disappear. And especially when we deal with the ones that we avoid or we repress or the ones that we explain away. You see, unless we actually engage our emotions and deal with them, usually what happens is they just end up bouncing around inside us. And sometimes what ends up happening is they get redirected in ways that can be damaging. But here's the thing, when we begin to process our feelings, we find that our emotions, our feelings, even our negative ones, even the ones that we call or label negative, they are all an opportunity for us to connect with God, and they can be an opportunity for us to connect with others. And they can also be an opportunity for us to grow through them, an opportunity for us to know and love and accept ourselves. You see, my hope for us is that we wouldn't just wait for COVID just to go away before we begin living again. You see, my hope is that even now, we would begin to grow in our emotional awareness. We would begin to experience more of life, even if there are all sorts of different pandemic restrictions around us. So a couple prayers that we can pray as we ask God to help us to know our feelings. The first prayer is this: Lord, help me become familiar with my own heart. Lord, help me become familiar with my own heart. And the second prayer is this: Lord, I bring you the shadow and the light within my heart. Make me whole in your love. All right? And so just a couple of questions that if you want to go on this journey, begin this journey of kind of figuring out what's kind of going on inside you, here are 4 questions that can really help us begin processing our emotions and getting more in touch with our feelings. The first question is often the hardest question for me. The first question is, what are you mad about? Second question, what are you sad about? Third question, what are you anxious or worried about? And the fourth question, what are you glad about? I wonder as a church if we take time, over the next couple of days, over the course of a week. And if we end our day and we just pause for a moment, maybe brew ourselves a cup of tea, something to help us, slow down a little bit, and we were to go through those questions, I wonder if we're able to become more aware of things that we're actually feeling and experiencing throughout the day. And not only would we become aware of what we're experiencing emotionally, but in our emotions to be able to bring all of that before God and experience Him interacting with us, Him healing us, Him encouraging us, Him loving us as we experience all the highs and all the lows in life.